everyone. So for this video, we are going to discuss the TOK prescribed title number 6. Is empathy an attribute that is equally important for a historian and a human scientist? Discussed with a reference to history and the human sciences. So let's first discuss the keyword that we need to focus with this title. Okay, so the keyword that we need to focus is, of course, the empathy, right? And also, we are going to discuss this word empathy by referencing to history and the human scientist. So we have our AOKs chosen already. So for this essay, since it says the question starts with, is empathy an attribute, right? And also it is in a question form. So we have to answer this question either yes, empathy is an attribute, or no, empathy is not an attribute. Okay, so with this in our mind, let's first discuss the knowledge framework that we are going to use to analyze this essay. Okay, so there are 4 elements of the knowledge framework, right? However, with this essay, we are just going to use 3 elements. They are scope, perspectives, and methods and tools. Okay, then let's talk about the scope first. Okay, scope is the element of the knowledge framework that we are going to use to construct your essay. Okay, so let's say we are using scope to construct our essay. Then we have to do, or you have to explore the lore and significance of empathy within each area of knowledge, which is the history and the human sciences, and discuss how empathy influences the understanding of the human experiences and events in both fields. Okay, then let's say if you're trying to use perspective to construct your essay, in that case you have to consider how empathy shapes the interpretation of historical narratives. Okay, that's versus the human science research. So let's say HS research. And also you need to discuss whether empathy introduces the subjectivity or enriches the understanding in each field. Okay, then let's say you're trying to use the method and tools of the knowledge framework to construct your essay. In that case, okay, you have to analyze the methodological difference between history and human science in incorporating empathy. Okay, you need to analyze, let's just write it here. So you need to analyze the methodological difference between history and human science in incorporating empathy. And also, in that cases, like, historians might use empathy to understand motivations and context, right? However, why human scientists might consider it in qualitative research or when interpreting human behavior. Then, let's talk about the introduction. So, introduction, you always have to start your introduction with interesting about the prescribed title question, okay? And then you need to define the key terms in this title. So we have only one word, right, which is the empathy. And then what you want to do is introducing the concept of the empathy and its relevance in understanding your AOKs, which is the history and human science. And also you want to state your thesis statement. And by doing that, you also want to give the reader a roadmap, clarify for the reader how you're going to explore the essay question. Is it yes or no? Also briefly explain how you're going to make the argument in your body. So for example, like what your outline of the body looks like, but not in detail. Okay, so we need to remember that the roadmap is just a summary, right? It's not detailed description. So it's just summary with a thesis statement. That's what you need to remember. Then let's talk about the essay format. Okay, so with this essay, we are going to follow our typical TOK essay format. Starts with the introduction, and you're going to have your first AOK, and your second AOK, and your conclusion. Okay, so when you're representing your AOK, you always need to have a claim, counterclaim, and then sub conclusion, or you can also say that this is a mini conclusion, right? Just for the first AOK, okay? And also for the second AOK, you need to have your claim, counterclaim, and sub-conclusion. And then when you're talking about the sub-conclusion or mini conclusion, right? This is, you have to consider it as a development section. So this is more of the, let's write this here. This is more of the development section, like you are trying to develop a mini conclusion of what you did with your AOK, okay? And you also want to link what you did with that AOK back to the prescript title by writing the mini conclusion and also highlight the insights you have had about this AOK and the prescript title. And that's what you need to do. And then once you're done writing your body parts, you're going to write your conclusion. Oh, and of course, we're going to discuss conclusion later in this video, but conclusion is more of the summary of these two mini conclusions. Okay, then let's talk about the body parts. So the history part, our first AOK, right? This is our first AOK, AOK number 1. And I'm just going to talk about this history part of your essay, like if I'm saying yes to the our question or the prescribed title, okay? So since I'm saying yes to the prescribed title, I'm going to agree that empathy is essential, right? Empathy is an attribute that is equally important for historian and a human scientist. So in that case, I'm going to say my claim is empathy is essential in history as it enables historians to reconstruct past events with a deeper understanding of the human experiences involved. Once I have presented my claim for the history, I need to identify the example that can be analyzed to back up my claim, right? And also my counterclaim for this case. And also for my counterclaim for this case will be empathy can compromise objectivity in history by introducing personal biases into the analysis of the event. So if this is my counterclaim, it's the same for the counterclaim too, just like the claim, right? We have to have example to back up this counterclaim, and we also need to analyze this example to resolve our counterclaim. So we can back up our claim, right? And you need to have your mini conclusion here or the sub conclusion, okay? Let's talk about this claim and counterclaim further. So I told you that I'm going to support the title, prescript title number 6, right? So I'm saying that empathy is an attribute, right? So this is the case where empathy is an attribute. And in that case, if I'm going to construct my essay using the scope of the knowledge perspective, I'm going to say, so here, this is the scope. I'm going to say empathy allows historians to perceive the motivations and emotions of the historian figures, providing context beyond mere facts, right? So as I told you before, I'm trying to explore the lore and the significance of the empathy within each AOK, discussing how empathy influences the understanding of the human experiences and events in both fields. Then, to support this parts, we get this statement. So in that case, I want to identify the example where, such as, when studying the civil rights movements, understanding the lived experiences of the activists add depth to the historical narrative, right? Then if I'm using the perspective aspect of the knowledge framework, uh, if my statement is like incorporating empathy helps historians present more nuanced interpretations by considering the diverse viewpoints. Just like I told you before, I'm trying to consider how empathy say, shapes interpretation of the historical narratives versus human sciences research, right? And discuss whether empathy introduces subjectivity or enriches the understanding each field. And in this case, uh, I'm going to try to find the example such as, presenting, like analyzing the diary of the Anne Frank with with empathy allows historians to convey the personal impact of the Holocaust rather than presenting solely statistical data. Okay, and if I'm using the method and tools of the knowledge framework, methods and tools, my statement is like oral histories and personal narratives are methodologies where empathy is crucial. Then my example that I'm going to find to support this statement will be like, we will be focusing on, whether the use of the survivor testimonies in Holocaust studies reflect empathy as a methodological tool for historical accuracy or something like that, right? I'm going to find the examples that are related to like this statement here. Then let's talk about the counterclaim. So with the counterclaim, I'm saying that empathy is not attribute. And with the scope, I'm going to find the examples where, cases like, romanticizing historical figures may result in the biased accounts. And then like statement for that will be overemphasis on empathy can overshadow factual accuracy. And then if I'm using the perspectives, so let's write this here. My statement would be like an empathetic approach might favor particular narratives while ignoring others. And in those cases, the examples will be like, nationalistic histories might amplify the empathy felt toward one's own country, disregarding the opposite perspectives. And then lastly, the method, using the method and tools. If my statement is like historiography can become distorted if empathy overrides critical evaluation. And examples, when I'm trying to find the examples, I might think about in the cases where misinterpreting historical intentions due to projecting modern sensibilities onto past actions. Okay. Then let's talk about the human science. So again, I'm saying yes, right, to the title. So in that case, my claim will be like empathy plays a vital role in human sciences as it facilitates understanding of the complex human behaviors and social phenomena. And the counterclaim will be relying on empathy can introduce subjectivity interpretations leading to flawed conclusions in human sciences. And in both cases, I have to find the example and I have to analyze to support that example and the claim, right? For the counterclaim, I have to find the example again. But in this case, I have to analyze it to resolve the counterclaim, to support my claim, right? And then I need to have my sub-conclusion. Okay, then Let's talk about this claim and counterclaim. So let's say I'm trying to find the examples for the claim, this human with the human sciences. So if I'm using the scope aspect, my statement will be in qualitative research, empathy enables human scientists to interpret data within the context of the personal experiences. Then I'm going to find the examples where, in the cases such as the ethnographic studies on marginalized communities rely on empathetic engagement to build trust and gain authentic insights, right? And then if I'm using perspectives, my statement will be empathy helps human scientists understand cultural differences and social dynamics. And then my example will be, like I'm going to try to find the examples where, like, such as in psychology, understanding the emotional state of the participants aid in interpreting behavior patterns, right? And then when we have methods and tools, you know, my statements will be empathy-based methods such as interviews and participant observation help gather nuanced data. Then I'm going to find the examples where, you know, or like cases like anthropologists often immerse themselves in communities to develop an empathetic understanding of the cultural practices. Okay. Then let's talk about the counterclaim. So with the counterclaim, okay, with the scope, my statement will be like, emotional involvement and may lead to researcher bias, compromising the validity of the findings. Then I'm going to find the examples such in the cases where, confirmation bias in psychology if researchers sympathize too much with the participants' perspectives. And for the perspectives, if I'm using perspectives, my statement will be like overemphasis on empathy can lead to bias generalization rather than objective analysis. And in that cases, I'm going to find the example such in the cases where, sociological studies that overly emphasize with one social group may neglect opposing views. And then the method and tools. For this case, if the statement is qualitative approaches, while empathetic might lack the rigor of the quantitative method, then I'm going to find the examples in the cases like, interviews influenced by the empathy may elicit responses tailored to the researcher's perceived expectations. Okay. Then finally, let's talk about the conclusion. So your conclusion must include a lesson, statement, position, or insight about the ethical obligations by analyzing the example of your choice. This is more of the summary of the two sub-conclusions you had, but also including these 4 points. Okay, so you have to restate the thesis or central argument, briefly summarize your main claim or point. You also have to summarize the key points, highlight the examples or ideas you have used to support your argument, but do so concisely. Third, broaden the context, but this part is optional. You can end by expanding the significance of your argument to a larger context or offer a finer thought that reinforces its relevance. And lastly, end with the closing statement. Finish with a powerful statement or reflection that leaves the reader thinking. Okay, then for this title, make sure you recap the argument that empathy is equally significant in history and the human sciences, right? Or you can also just like use the same word as the title. You have to argue that, recap the argument that empathy is attribute that is equally important in history and the human sciences. Also conclude by asserting that empathy's value lies in its ability to humanize research and interpretations while being balanced with the critical analysis. Then let's talk about the examples. So when you're researching for evidences or the examples, think about if your example clearly illustrate the point you're making in terms of the empathy's role or importance, right? Um, don't just name drop a historical event or study, right? explain how empathy is operating in that context. So first three examples are the examples for the claim. Here, the slave narratives of the Frederick Douglass's writing. This can be an example that uh, can be derived using the scope of your knowledge framework. So in these cases, when studying slave narratives like those of the Frederick Douglasses, empathy helps historians understand the lived trauma of the enslaved individuals, right? So we can discuss those and moving beyond legal or economic analysis of the slavery. And then next one is the perspectives example. So in analyzing World War I trench diaries, empathy allows historians to adopt the viewpoints of the ordinary soldiers, offering insight into fear, boredom, and despair that are often lost in macro level military history. And then here I have a method example. The use of the oral history in truth and reconciliation commissions, like post-apartheid South Africa, or the First Nations example in Canada, relies on empathy to validate personal testimonies that aren't captured by the official records. Then let's talk about the counterclaim examples. So here I have a counter example for history. Counterclaim example. So for the scope, the revisionist histories of the colonization. So overemphasizing with the colonizers can lead to the glorified narratives as seen in some older British textbooks, right? So you can use the example by referring to the history textbooks, right? And the perspectives examples are like empathetic bias may lead to historical presentism, judging by the past by today's values, right? For example, interpreting Asian practices solely through a modern moral lens, right? That can be a good perspective example. And then if you're thinking about examples that can be used with the method and tools of the knowledge framework, you can think about the biographics of the controversial figures like Hitler and Stalin. Can be because this can be problematic, right? If the biographer's empathy clouds critical analysis, potentially humanizing these atrocities, right? Then let's talk about the human science examples. Again, I have examples for claim and examples for counterclaim. So ethnographic research, using ethnographic research such as the IBMATH study of these Samoan teenagers, empathy allowed her to assess intimate cultural perspectives not available through the quantitative method. And in clinical psychology, there can be a lot of examples from the clinical psychology cases, such as Carl Rogers' humanistic approach. This is called a person-centered therapy. Because this humanistic approach emphasizes the unconditional positive regard, means an empathetic stance that helps psychologists understand clients' subjective experiences. Okay, then let's talk about the anthropology cases, right? There are going to be a lot of examples that you can use from the anthropology, just like the clinical psychology. So participant observation in anthropology, like the Brunislaw's work in the Trobriand Islands, required empathetic immersions to grasp cultural meanings from an insider's perspectives. So there can be a good examples, right? You need to do some research on it. Then for the counterclaim examples, in sociology, over-identifying with the community, like gangs and cults, might lead to over-rapport, right? Where researchers avoid critical questioning to maintain trust. And also another example can be Hawthorne effect. So this is like happens when we have interview-based research. So Hawthorne effect shows that participants may alter their behavior if they sense empathetic engagement, like skewing data. And then also, in the cases, in case studies of the addiction or trauma, researchers may become too emotionally involved, blurring boundaries. So you can also find the good examples for these cases, right? So the examples that I just discussed here are the just small parts of the field, right? What you need to do is you have to find the example that fit for your statements, right? And that's something that you know already, something that you can discuss it uh, rationally, okay? So that's it for the title number 6. Good luck, everyone. Make sure you subscribe and like the video. Thank you.